Good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, whatever time of day it is, whatever part of the world you're in, you're really, really welcome to this, the third of our series of Framing Aging Dialogues, which is exploring how cultural gerontology, in its many forms and shapes, can give us a better understanding of the richness, the issues, the challenges of aging, and widen the perspectives both of the gerontologists and those in the arts and humanities. This has been a really exciting venture. I'm standing in for Andrew King, who's indisposed, and we wish him all well. And our program again today is as rich as it was. We've really explored a huge amount of things in our previous webinars, and if I briefly mention some of them, such as challenging neoliberal and ableist assumptions about aging, a critique of the successful aging model, the darker sides of aging, and accepting that although we do need to reassess decline narratives, they're not necessarily ageist because decline does happen. Difficult questions about the good life at the end of the life cycle, literary representations, artistic representations, experiences of precarity. And this is a really important dialogue as a gerontologist, but also engaged in the area. We're all learning in this. Michel Foucault talks about the medical gaze, whereby physicians were shuttered by their techniques, methodologies, and their way of doing business. But there are sociologists' gaze and psychologists' gaze. And what we're all doing is trying to liberate ourselves from these various gazes. So this is a very new way for many of us doing business. So all our speakers have been good enough to recognize this through 15-minute. We're going to have three 15-minute presentations. Then we'll have 5-minute discussant from Susan Pickard of the University of Liverpool. And then we'll have 15 minutes for a panel. And I will try, I hope people won't feel I'm being too strict if we try to keep to this. I think also for the other side of a Zoom, it is challenging to keep attention going. And I think, to be concise is the most supreme of all virtues in academia. Uh, the panel will be discussing live and will be to and fro, and you'll see our faces. For most of us, I think one or two, for other reasons, are unable. But from our participants who are not panelists, please put comments and questions up on the chat. Hopefully most of us are used to this. This is down at the bottom of your Zoom screen between participants and share screen. And we'll try and bring these in. The panelists will see these as well. So hopefully this will inform our lively discussion. So delighted to start off with all the full biographies are on the Reframing Aging website, and we don't want to eat into our precious time. So, and I think none of our speakers will feel diminished because we don't give a full bio online now, on live. So starting out with one of our consortium, Julia Langbein, Research Fellow at Trinity College, Dublin, on theorizing a visual culture of old age, the case of Neo-Impressionism. Julia, thank you.
Well, first of all, I just want to say very briefly that I'm one of the newest here, I think, to the field of the history of age or to aging, to thinking about old age. And so I've benefited hugely from everyone's expertise. So while I have the floor, I just want to say thank you so much to all the presentations that have gone before. So my talk will use the case of the French chemist and theorist M.E. Chevreul, who was exceptionally long-lived, and he held a singular position at the nexus of art and science, to contrast two antithetical models of visualizing old age. So I'll focus in particular on two visual events in the life of Chevreul, one following from his scientific work and the other from his public persona. This contrast is embedded in the particular 19th century media history that I'm looking at, but I hope it will be useful to thinkers across disciplines grappling with contemporary images, particularly because the historical moment that I'm focusing on is really at the dawn of a modern consumer economy of images that won't be completely unfamiliar to us. So we're going to begin in the present with Twitter. So I don't know. I don't know if Tom Scharf is in attendance today, or if any of you have been following his Twitter. I'm sure many of you have. But he's kind of had this important project of finding ageist images in the media and making us aware of them. So the original title of my talk was "Theorizing a Visual Culture of Old Age," and I'm sure that's why I'm in the methodology panel. And over the past couple sessions of the conference, it's become apparent to me how important photography is and how urgently we need to think about it. But I am still concerned here to ask broader methodological questions like why is it that picturing old age is such a problematic enterprise on the whole? What is it about visual data when it meets old age that is such an intransigent issue? So these ageist media images are very typical, and I'll just point out some of the things that you can all see. But the substitution of part for whole, as Sharf has shown, is a particularly common feature, reducing the entire individual to hands, often gripping and support. It's a very efficient way to illustrate a whole social stereotype of older people as burden. The quasi grotesque focus on wrinkled hands or bloated ankles is a visual reality effect. In contrast to picturesque images, this one sells itself as unvarnished. The problem here lies not with the images themselves, I would argue, but with a pre existing non visual definition of old age that these images illustrate. They're called upon to illustrate a very limited definition of older people as weak and needy. The images themselves are authorless. They're often from an encyclopedic pile of stock images, contributing to the idea of the picture as universal, as unmediated. Truth function, of course, here serves the financial interests of the site. They justify the luridness and artificially terrifying headlines that these images illustrate. And yet, this kind of image has become so naturalized. Indeed, even well intentioned academics and universities have been caught out for relying on precisely this kind of picture. So, art history may seem the furthest discipline from what many of you do. You know, turning to subjects like impressionist painting in the early newspaper, which I'm about to do, might feel like leaving the halls of science and entering the cocktail party. But art history at its best attends to the kind of knowledge that images produce, that they alone materialize. Part of what's so pernicious about the ageist imagery of the news cycle and the internet is that these images don't generate knowledge. They're called upon to illustrate pre-existing stereotypes. In fact, the word stereotype took on its modern meaning in the early years of the illustrated press to describe the press's ability to produce images that multiplied without ever changing. So these are the first two images that came up on my computer when I Googled old age. Um, the visualization is so conditioned by photographic stereotype that I find it almost impossible to think of a quote image of old age that is not figurative and photographic, a record of biological signs like posture, white hair, wrinkles. These are the first two Google image search results for old age. The European man modeling, some kind of cognitive change, whether it's an expansion or a destruction, I don't know. And then, of course, the non-European woman fetishized for her wizened exterior. But how did we find ourselves here? Chevreul interestingly played a key role in the history of this problem, I think, and helps us historicize our own problems. So Chevreul had a remarkable biography in life, which I'm only going to very, very briefly give you some points of. But he was born under the Ancien regime, born in 1786, and died, 10 days after the inauguration of the Eiffel Tower. He died in 1889. He was trained as a chemist and directed the tapestry manufacturer, the national tapestry manufacturer, where observations of dyes inspired his theories of color and perception. He's widely cited in art history for his role in color theory, particularly for how that was used by the Impressionists. So, the first of the visual events in his life that I want to explore is a photo shoot from 1886, the celebration of his centenary, which should make us all think of Rena's presentation on the cult of the centenarian. Um, to mark the centenary of his birth in September of 1886, the photographer Nadar published what's been called the first photo interview in the Parisian newspaper Le Journal Illustré. This particular photo shoot has been called the birth of the modern illustrated press. It's a huge, and I have like a 45-pound history of photography, and this takes up its own, section of it. It's a widely studied moment in the history of the press image. The journal published 13 photographs of Chevreul accompanied by Nadar's report of the interview, published as captions. The interview format had been adopted by newspapers to burnish their credibility as an informational press, moving away from eclectic imagery, opinion, gossip. Particular reproductive technology at work here is important. The halftone screen was new, a pivotal technique for the transition to this kind of credibility. These are images of older people from the Illustrated Press from the 1840s, so just a few decades earlier. And they are handmade wood engravings. The one on the left is the artist Granet, who had died that year. And the one on the right is a rag picking doctor If you want to print out of that for your office, anyone, let me know. But interestingly, when I was looking for comparative images on the press before this moment, the only images of older people I found were reproductions of prints and paintings, or images like this that are highly, particularly the one on the right of the rag picker, highly conditioned by or entirely governed by the codes of classical painting. I mean, look at the child in the background is right out of a Poussin or something like that, a religious painting, and the doctor clearly a Jesus figure. So these archetypal figures are not exclusively, but they were largely wise or noble. Likewise, photography was until the 1880s really more aligned with fine arts than with science. So this helps us see the newness of the Chevreul interview. As one critic described, it involved no interpretation. It was the exact reproduction, including all the suspensions that permit conversation. It is a document of absolute exactitude. Nadar said of the interview, for the first time, the reader will be effectively a spectator, as if he were there. Nadar's appearance in the photographs um, was a kind of sleight of hand, as if he putting the idea in the viewer's head that Nadar was behind the camera, was not behind the camera, but that the image was somehow self-generating. And yet it's all completely staged. The Chevreul, his slippers and his blanket were props used in Nadar's studio to connote the intimacy of the domestic, although it unfolded in a commercial setting. Um, in fact, while the article's title, How to Live to 100, seemed like a generous how-to, might make us think of kind of successful aging language. The whole thing was sponsored by George Eastman's new instantaneous film. The interview was a new commercial format selling a new commercial product announced on the terrain of old age. The picture on the right is by the Finnish artist Albert Edelfelt, um, and it's of Louis Pasteur. So Chevreul's fame as a scientist figured prominently in the text, but not at all in the image, which compared to this portrait of Pasteur, painted just a year before, a staged performance of intelligence and self-possession, Chevreul's surface qualities as an old person are clearly being separated out and relished by the camera. There's no question this is rich terrain for the photograph. Chevreul is pictorially a demanding subject, rife with textural detail. Wrinkles, stubbly beard, diaphanous hair. An engraver surely would have botched. Chevreul is alert, but also he's exoticized like a rare species. The sense of this as an ethnography reminds us that photography is deeply implicated in the history of 19th century imperialist expansion. There's a large body of work on this history, very much an ongoing history, as Teju Cole, for example, wrote in The New Yorker in 2019, of modern imperialist photography and racist colonialist photography. Right? The sequence of several photos was a breakthrough in the vision of intimacy that it afforded viewers, but even this seemed particularly well suited to the subject of old age as it communicated pauses of an perhaps addled mind or searching for words. To be sure, realist devices and claims for universal truth were made in plenty of other media. But what's remarkable here is that we can see the press photography establishing its truth claims in order to isolate and exaggerate the biological record of old age for its own gain from the start. The Chevreul photo interview was published at the dawn of what we recognize as modern media. The Journal Illustré would soon reach 1 million subscribers. Photographic illustration migrated from specialized journals to saturate urban life. Photography's claims to neutrality, just being articulated in the 1880s with the exemplary image of old age, are now completely naturalized. I'm now going to turn to a completely different kind of image. And I hope you'll pardon this. It's going to be a bit art historical, but we'll all survive. So this is the color wheel that Chevreul invented. Sorry, it's a terrible image, but you get the idea. As I mentioned earlier, Chevreul's work on color theory is important in art history, and particularly is fundamental to a new understanding of vision. The eye had been understood since classical philosophy as a window, transparent and universal. Chevreul described it as dynamic, embodied and subjective. So, for example, the idea that if you retinal fatigue, if you look at the color green for too long and then look at a white wall, you'll see red. That's because your eyes is exhausted by what it sees, and therefore it produces images, it produces colors. This was grounds for the Impressionist idea that the viewer's eye would do the mixing of the colors rather than the painter mixing colors on the canvas. It was also important for theories of race and gendered vision later. These examples of two paintings of the same subject by Monet and Renoir, like this classic intro to art history slide about the way that that Impressionism was about depicting an individual's retinal impression. So important for our purposes today is that Chevreul was a public authority on aging. Well into his 80s, he gave a series of lectures on the subject at the Faculty of Medicine in Paris in the 1870s, published and widely circulated. In these lectures, Chevreul located physiological decline associated with aging in the eye. His theory was that decline began in the eye, which triggered weakening everywhere else. For example, physical mobility will decline when sight, which coordinates movement, ceases to orient it properly. For my purposes today, what's important about this expansive essay is that Chevreul stressed old age perception is characterized by unboundedness, vagueness, perceiving a world of inadequate contrasts. One must hold on to and cultivate what he called distinct vision by, for example, reading pages on which evenly sized and highly contrasting text has been printed. So in the 1880s, following Chevreul's lectures on aging, a group of artists began to reframe the achievement of Impressionism negatively, calling themselves the Neo-Impressionists. Oh God, sorry, I didn't realize that once it was blown up, these images would be such terrible resolution. But on the right, you could basically for this talk, you could put any Neo-Impressionist image against any Impressionist image. But on the right, we have Signac's portrait of Félix Fénéon from 1890. And on the left, we have Monet's Impression Sunrise, the exemplary image of Impressionism, the one that got its name. So in 1880, these group of artists began to reframe the achievements of Impressionism negatively, call themselves Neo-Impressionists, and specifically citing Chevreul on color. The Neo-Impressionists, Seurat, Pissarro, Signac, I'm sure many of their images will be coming to your mind, defined Impressionism not as an exploration of individual retinal impressions, but as unstructured, decorative, feminine. And I believe they associated Impressionism with old age. This aesthetic reframing was accompanied by a social one. The Impressionists had been welcoming to all ages and to women. Neo-Impressionism described itself as a young man's game, purging the older cohort, explicitly aligning a return to monumentality in their painting and vigor with the ideology of youth and masculinity. I don't have time here to go
Julia,
into how
would-
Neo-Impressionism manifested their work as a young eye over and against Impressionism's old eye. But what's important to me, what I find really remarkable and what I want to retain from this episode, which I sort of dared to go into despite knowing that it's, very, very, it may seem a strange terrain for sociologists and clinicians and so on, is that the is what I want to retain here is how um, at the intersection of the history of age, scientific imagery, and avant-gardism for a group of painters in the 1880s, this this is an image of old age. It doesn't depict old age. It's not by the hand of an old artist. The content doesn't scream old age. But while the portrait of Chevreul was an image of old age in a medium just securing its truth claims, the Impressionist painting became an image of old age exactly because its truth claims fell apart. This is how the retina sees, claimed the Impressionists, and the Neo-Impressionists said, we don't believe that anymore. This isn't a vision. This is not vision at work. It's the decaying sensorium of the old person in its very mark. The Neo-Impressionists, importantly, were not illustrating Chevreul's ideas. Rather, they were part of a broader interest in vision and cognition, according to which this cheerful scene of a boating party was an image of decline, of old age specifically. For many who study old age, as I've framed these pictures, the Neo-Impressionist interpretation of Impressionism is an example of ageism. This group of, do I have, let's compare these.
Julia, if you could just finish up there, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm concluding right now. So the Neo-Impressionist interpretation of Impressionism is an example of ageism. This group of young men characterized old age as decline. They placed it along with the feminine and the economically unproductive sphere, something that's familiar to us today. Meanwhile, the picture of Chevreul might be considered a good image, active at 100, lauded for his intellect. And yet I come back over and over again to the idea of Impressionism as a visualization of old age, to prime my own sensitivity to such possibilities today, to moments of porousness between the medical, scientific, and artistic languages, to moments when the image generates new ideas rather than illustrating stereotypes, and to image in which the content, it doesn't suffer from a photographic literalism about the vision of old age. The Chevreul interview is remarkable for the way it shows in retrospect how ideal the subject of old age is for photojournalism, and for how it shows that such images are not timeless, but were born with the modern press. As if to prove my point, this is the last image I promise. I went to a stock image site and Googled old age, and I got this picture of Brawl, um, which is kind of gone through some kind of computer program that makes it look like it's drawn or something, begging you to believe its authenticity, even as if even more so than a photograph. Um, pretending to be a handmade image, even though it's not. So okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Julia, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it, and certainly opened my eyes, if I'm not sharing too much of the language, to the possibilities of thinking through the color, the production, the background, the chemistry even of this, and it's
Yes,
making
sir.
Goethe and his color theory. So plenty of fruit for discussion there. Thank you very much. Our next speaker from Queen's University Belfast, Gemma Carney, has actually very nicely decided to bring us into the age of coronavirus. How could we have this altered workshop format? We're thinking about aging and coronavirus, old age, the time of greatest vulnerability. So, in a change of program, Gemma's going to talk to us about old age in the age of coronavirus, a qualitative media analysis. Gemma, thanks very much.
Okay, this is a piece of work that I did with some colleagues over the last few months. So not to at all claim that I did all this myself, it would have been impossible. But basically, when we were working on it, it really occurred to me that this would be absolutely perfect thing to share with this network, because actually what we were looking at was how age is framed during the pandemic. And I apologize for bringing everybody back into the pandemic. I know Julia's talk was a beautiful bit of escapism there. But basically what we did was we did a framing analysis of how age was presented by the media during the first wave in UK media in particular. And this is part of kind of a move of understanding amongst us in social policy around the importance of the influential role that the media has in terms of particularly, say, talking about the welfare state and things, but also really in terms of public health messaging. And I know Susan, who's the discussant, has published a fantastic paper in the Journal of Social Policy, which you should all read, about the media's role in intergenerational justice and things. And this paper, I think, really speaks to the work that she's done and to earlier work that's done by social work colleagues around the time, if any of you remember, there was a case of baby P. And this is a thing that keeps coming up, particularly under the neoliberal regime, something that we discussed a lot at the last webinar, and I wanted to bring back into the talk today because I thought it was a fruitful kind of line of us all working together as critics. And that is this idea that when you have this neoliberal government who are very happy to disassociate themselves from decisions, particularly the negative outcome of decisions that they've made in the past, such as, say, cutting back on childcare, or allowing poverty to run out of control, or say, let's say, allow a pandemic to run out of control, then what they tend to do is the media will help them to find somebody who they can kind of blame, and often that will be some kind of public sector person. But I also, I really don't want the research really wasn't about trying to blame the media, because the media had, like everybody else at the moment, a really difficult job to do and a really influential role. But we need to also talk about our kind of role in this. And I think the work that Tom's doing is a really good example of what we could do in terms of, really being critical and being more assertive, really, in terms of informing public debate. And I think this is interesting because following on from what Julia said, and Tom and his colleagues work around images, what we're doing with this project is kind of looking at the words. So because we're looking at media stories. Before I go into the media analysis, I think it's important that I actually share with you some of the facts, because you'll see there's quite a lot of in the media just kind of mad generalizations and stereotypes. But yes, older people have been very badly affected, and everything I say today is just referring to the first wave. That's when this analysis was done over the summer. But you can see here that in the UK, most of the people who died as a result of contracting COVID were over 75. I'm giving you the figures there for Northern Ireland, but it was similar all around the UK. The other thing is that we have this, figure of excess deaths. If you understand that correctly, it's the idea of not just the people who died of COVID, but the people who died at the time we wouldn't have expected to die. And so they're excess deaths caused by the pandemic. So they could have died of something else because they weren't getting treatment or whatever. And that turns out to be very important when you look at older people. And I'll come to that later. The other thing is that the Tory government, the Tories have been in charge in the UK, well, in England in particular, but then the Westminster government as a result, for the last 10 years or so. And they have really worked very hard to remove a lot of the social protections. I suppose Brexit is the pinnacle of that. But what they've tried to do is really, really reduce the influence of the state. But one thing that has maintained its prominence and that they used very effectively in the Brexit referendum was the NHS, because the NHS is very much associated with British culture, and they've kind of appropriated it as part of kind of English nationalism too. But what happened was that from the pandemic hit, they really started to talk about, we needed to protect the NHS, stay home, save life, protect the NHS. And what they actually did was, when they realized that their NHS hospitals had many, many older people in them, that wasn't really the appropriate place for them because there is no agreement on how to fund social care. So many older people end up kind of stuck in hospital. What they did was decided to move a lot of older people out of those hospital beds in order to free up the beds for the expected surge of COVID patients. But what they didn't have was a decent testing regime. They didn't have all of these little kind of archipelago of care homes were really hard to kind of keep the infection out. And a lot of staff were agency staff, and many, you can see them from the deaths that I'm showing here. This analysis was done by the Health Foundation, that lots and lots of older people died as a result. And I'll come back to that again at the end of the talk. But an interesting point to note as well is that of the 30,500 deaths in care homes, the Health Foundation think only 10,000 were caused by COVID. And we'll get back to that later in the talk as well. The other point I want to make is that what comes across all the time during the pandemic is that, only older people die of COVID, or somehow that's okay because they're older. We expect older people to die. But I wanted to put up some of these statistics from Public Health England, which are from 2016, and they really show how actually, even when you're older, you still kind of have a decent life expectancy. So if you're 75, you'd have another 12 or 13 years to live. If you're 85, you'd have another 7 years. So the people still are dying prematurely. And this person here is Chris Whitty. You might recognize him. He's a kind of our Anthony Fauci, and he even came out early in the pandemic and put a story out in the media that if you get coronavirus when you're over 80, you're not a goner. That was the headline. But there is some, obviously truth in the fact that older people are more likely to die of coronavirus than other groups. So I thought it was worth having a little look at that. The first thing to note, is that older populations are different populations. So we're living longer, but we do have chronic diseases, and our immune system does change. Now, obviously, Des can give you the full talk on this, but that's important, to take into account in terms of the social context as well, because things like gender really have an important role in that. So a lot of those very older people are actually disproportionately female. So it's a lot of very old women who've been affected by this. In countries like China, it's most of the smokers are men, and they found that actually in the first wave, there was a lot of men who succumbed to COVID. The other thing, this is the real kind of social policy stuff coming out now, that, where you live greatly affects. So if you live in a care home, that could be much more important than your age, or it could be one of the factors. But the overall, kind of comment I want to make, and I wanted to take forward before we get into the media analysis, is to say that healthy older people, you're still more likely to survive than die if you contract COVID. And we use this example, which was a photograph from the Observer of Maria Brañas, and in the first research update that we produced with this project, because she was 113, she survived coronavirus. She's a Spanish lady who'd lived through the Spanish flu and 2 world wars, and the media used her as an example. But actually, a lot of the media reports were about how older people will die of coronavirus. But we did 3 particular searches, and I'm going to share with you a very small amount of 2 of them. The first one was, how was age used in public messaging in the earliest days of the pandemic? So the first 2 weeks of March, when our world kind of fell apart and we all started to realize what we were living through. And the second one, I think, is fascinating, because this is the letters from older people to the editors of newspapers that they wrote during the lockdown. And there's some really great examples of older people kind of making the point that the chronological age and self-isolation policy was not something that they were really thought was very fair. It's important to note as well that, there's a lot in the paper about this, about why we chose certain papers, but you can see here it's important to look that we're trying to think as being kind of liberal lefties, many of us academics, that everybody reads The Guardian, but you can see here that's much smaller than something like the Daily Mail. So in terms of the stories and the reach that newspapers would have, this Daily Mail kind of thinking is going to be much more the norm. So the two problems, we found about 6 problems when we did the search, but the problems that I'm going to highlight, because I think they're interesting, particularly in the context of the discussion we had about neoliberalism last week, or not last week, last webinar before Christmas last year, was that older people, the first, I'm calling these problems because the framing analysis that we use is developed by Foley and colleagues. So these are public health specialists, and they say that, they use the example of obesity and diabetes, and they say what happens is something is portrayed as a problem. So it's defined as a problem. So they say the problem with people having diabetes is that they're overweight. And then there's some kind of causal attribution made, it's because they're overweight, they have diabetes. So it often ignores the nuance of things like genetics or other factors. Then there's a moral evaluation. These fat people are giving themselves diabetes, this kind of thing. And then the outcome is that people are kind of blamed for having diabetes. So we see something similar happening around old age, that older people are seen as more likely to die of coronavirus than any other section of the population, particularly if they have an underlying condition. And what we really find when we start to kind of dig into that is that there's an element of the rest of us trying to distance ourselves from this scary disease. So there's an element of saying, well, older people belong to this category, so and people with underlying conditions, so maybe disabled people as well, they're in this category that doesn't, the rest of us are okay. So it kind of helps us to feel safe. The other problem I'm going to focus on is this one around heartless bureaucrats. So The Guardian in particular was absolutely fascinating in how every single story was about how bad the government was. Fair enough, it's not a great government, but it was relentless. And then they also kept bringing in experts. So this goes back to a few years ago when Brexit started and when Trump was popular, that this idea of experts being annihilated. But experts have come back into fashion in the pandemic. Thank God for all of us here. But what they really said is that there's these kind of compassionate experts. They'll tell us how to behave and they'll help us get out of it. But the tabloid media in particular had much more this sense of, but there's also heartless bureaucrats. And I'm going to take you through an example of that. So let's just look and dig down a little bit into this one about older people who are more likely to die of coronavirus. So this was in all of the newspapers. And this was really clearly that there's this moral tone to it too, that if you're older, you're more likely to die, so you should be self-isolating and staying at home. And younger people are selfish if they party, they're putting older people at risk. The next one about the heartless bureaucrats, I think we are a particularly good panel to kind of look at this one. And this was an example of Professor June Andrews. So this was, all of the papers annihilated this woman early in March. And what she did was, I'm showing you now, rather than my analysis, I'm showing you some of the headlines so you can see what was said. But she was an NHS employee who was kind of involved in, innovation and change, one of these kind of people. And she was presenting, making a case for what to do to the Public Accounts Committee in the Scottish Government. And when she made her presentation, she made this comment that, as I said at the start, a lot of the big problem in the UK system is that they haven't invested in social care. The system is still this kind of critical care system, and they haven't adjusted to the aging population. And certainly many older people don't have appropriate care. And what happens is then, of course, they end up getting stuck in critical care hospitals. So what she said was that the pandemic could be useful for clearing the bed blockers. And this was read as her having saying that it was good that the older people would die because it would clear the hospitals. And there's one headline here at the end from the Telegraph that kind of starts to maybe show some nuance, that the doctor said that she could kill off the bed blockers. This is June Andrews, but remarks show the crisis facing the NHS. So she does try and explain that, but that is completely and utterly thrown aside. And it really, really reminded me with work I found before done by the social workers, as I said, where Sharon Shoesmith was the head of children's services in Haringey Council when they had a child die in their care. And rather than media agreeing that, yeah, there's been rising inequality and massive child poverty, and this is a problem of neglect. And yet they actually said, well, these people, these social workers basically are responsible for this child's death. So it's very easy when you have a system and you don't want to, invest in the state, to blame the people that are doing the job that they haven't been funded properly to do. I'm now going to go into the letters, and I am going to show you some of these. So this is one, there was a good spread across the papers, actually. And the ones that I'm going to pick out just happen to be from The Guardian, but actually they were right across the papers, as you can see. But the general thrust, so these, you have to bear in mind that there was a very strong element of self-selection with this. So these are people who were articulate and confident enough to write to the editor of a newspaper, who were obviously well enough, but they were all older, and we know they were older because they said it. I'm over 70 and. So they said that they were missing their freedom. The government should trust older people to make their own decisions, that this life is hardly worth living. And what's really interesting is that there was a whole kind of sense of intergenerational discord emerging, and this kind of sense of, people virtue, showing how great and well behaved they could be, and also arguing that age is just one variable. So this person was Sally Phillips, and she was responding to a letter written by Sally Vickers. And she talks, it's worth having a look at this, the idiocy of this random cutoff point. She's talking about this cutoff point of, if you're over 70, you needed to stay at home. It's even more evident, the idiocy of it, if expressed as year of birth rather than age. Let's compare a non-smoker and moderate drinker born 1947, she's obviously talking about herself, with an officially approved body mass index, a career record of useful contribution to society, who's doing pro bono work currently frozen, to an overweight individual born June 1964, who's never done a day's useful work in his life and has been demonstrably reckless with his own health and that of others. Now let's decide which is the better bet for early release. Of course, she's talking about Boris Johnson there, who ended up getting coronavirus after shaking hands with coronavirus patients in the hospital early in the pandemic. So the point she's making, though, is more nuanced than that, because what she's saying is that it isn't just age. Age is not the only variable that matters. Boris was a good example of being not as old, but having not good underlying health.
Gemma, can we?
Yeah, I'm coming to the very end now. So this is the second last slide, but the last example I want to use, which was a retired social worker called Brian Parrott. And I won't go into it in detail for time reasons, but he made this point that he had spent years trying to get the funding to move people into care homes. And when COVID happened, the government did it. Suddenly the money was available, but they did it without having a proper testing system in place, and many, many older people died. So this analysis, this is my last slide. What does this framing analysis show us? I think it shows us how we can place older people in this category of other, and this allowed the rest of us to feel safe. It also, I think, raises a lot of questions about the human rights of older people and the fact that we don't have this kind of legal instrument protecting the rights of older people in the same way as we have for other groups. And the questions for us for discussion today really are we failing our older people, and thus are we failing our future older selves?
Thanks very much. And you've really given us that true feeling of framing aging and getting a perception of what the broader public think and feel. These are really, really important aspects and very useful methodology as well. So thanks, Gemma. Our last talk is from David Troyansky of Brooklyn University and Brooklyn College, and really looking CUNY. And what David is going to talk to us is JR's Wrinkles of the City project, representing global old age 2008 to 2015. David, over to you, and I'll give a bleep at 13 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks, Jess. So first, let me thank Anne because she actually got me to do this. I'm a historian. I work mostly on 18th and 19th century France. And when I had an email exchange with her about what I was going to do, I proposed something from a project on aging and retirement in the first half of the 19th century. And I also said I had just been to this exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum with a whole room of photos of older people from around the world. And Anne said, do that. So I did. And it's not my area of expertise, but I have spent a lot of time focusing on images of the aged in other times and other places. And every so often, it's good to check in on the present. So that gave me the chance to do that. Thanks also to Julia. One, she reminded me of the exchange I had with Rutledge over my last book cover, where they were using a stock image of an older person. And I rejected a whole bunch of them and had to go with something that still I'm not so happy with, but it's sort of the stereotype that she was talking about. And I think there are ways in which what she said about stereotype in stereotypical images and photographs of old people, it's something that connects to my topic because that lies at the background of all of this. So let me just say that I stumbled upon JR's project, or JR in English, Wrinkles of the City, in a retrospective exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum, which opened in October of 2019. And those who are familiar with JR generally know him from the 2017 film in which he collaborated with Agnès Varda, Visage Village, or Faces Places. I'm reminded of the fact that one of the themes running through that film was the juxtaposition of his youth and her age, crossing generations, but also crossing gender and crossing ethnic community and so on. But what they did in the film was to travel around France, photographing ordinary people and pasting larger-than-life portraits on the walls of their towns or workplaces. The public in the Paris region may recall JR as the photographer from the working-class immigrant banlieue who pasted portraits of people from his neighborhood on the walls of central Paris. And they're very much crossing a kind of racial divide as well as a class divide. Now, he's undertaken a project on Israelis and Palestinians, a project on the US-Mexican border, a series of portraits of impoverished women around the world called Women Are Heroes, a series of portraits of New Yorkers currently up at the Brooklyn Museum, and a number of projects in which he's asked ordinary people to become photographers themselves. And in all these projects, he's produced work that forces the viewer to confront people who are often overlooked. Along with the large pasted portraits, he's created books, documentary films, and audio files in which his subjects speak for themselves. And for our purposes, Wrinkles of the City, we have all of these things. The photographs, the books, the films, and so on. His work forces an examination of aged faces and the identities they represent in multiple cities around the world. And I was originally going to show these examples later on, but I'm going to go right to them, where these are a few examples of these images. So selected almost at random. So here's one from Havana. This is a married couple, Rafael Lorenzo Felo, age 90, Obdulia Manzano, or Otulia, age 82. And in the book version of Wrinkles of the City, Havana, you see the original portrait, you see a little text where he's the one speaking, and then you see the result of the pasting of the images on these walls. He talks about his life as a musician. He also mentioned she's basically relegated to the domestic sphere in terms of her children and their children. Here in the Los Angeles project, we have Carl Verden, a young guy, only 63, a carpenter. And in the text that accompanies the photo, he says, "My wrinkles represent time spent working for my family. They also represent aging. I remember looking down at my own wrinkled hands one day and thinking, those are my dad's hands. I'm becoming my dad. That's when I realized I was getting older." or in the project in Shanghai. This is Wu Zhengzhu, born in 1939. She recalls, or she talks about, it's not clear what she recalls, but she talks about the Japanese bombing in World War II. She was born in 39. The family fled Shanghai when she was 3 and came back when she was 7. And she speaks about her schooling, her family, her experience as a factory worker, and problems associated with the Cultural Revolution. Some of the memories are hers, some are things she's been told, but she reflects on change over time. So here are 3 others I wanted to show, selected almost at random. We've got this image of an older person's hand on a building in Los Angeles. We've got this eye, and I figured out this was drawn from a photograph of a woman in Havana named Nidia Rojas, also born 1939. And she talks about having gone from a provincial city to Havana in 1959. She speaks essentially of family life and food, but her eye is there pasted above an area where kids are playing football. And then I've got another image of a little more of the face from the project in Berlin. What we've got here is JR talking about how it was so important that he was close to his grandmothers, but he wants us to understand that their faces, the faces of these old people, represent not just their own personal and familial experience, but a time, a place, and a history. As in some of his other projects, most notably work produced in a public housing project undergoing demolition, he uses his characters to mark a moment of dramatic change in the urban landscape. His aged characters have a sense of past and present at a critical moment. So in the portraits, the films, and the books, we confront individuals who are witnessing the world being transformed around them. And he speaks of the walls themselves as having wrinkles. Here he speaks of his grandmothers born in 1915 and 1923. I quote, "They were telling me about their childhoods spent on 2 different continents, their husband who had been chosen for them by their parents. One spoke to me of decolonization, which had transformed her country, the other of the war, which had obliged her to run away alone with her son. One mentioned her choice to work when women were supposed to stay at home, the other of her difficulty to learn French." But even those grandmothers, representing the private or personal side of the question of aging, permit him to connect private history to public ones. And the second quote, "With them, I crossed the 20th century. I shared their secrets. I was in touch with sexism, racism, fear, stupidity, war, difference, submission, revolt, success, exile, failure, sadness, and joy. And I wanted to continue traveling to the past." So too in depicting older people he had just encountered and whose portraits he was pasting on city walls. He says, "I wanted to confront the facades with the people, the collective history with the individual's narrative." So the exhibition catalog describes the project as follows. I'm going to paraphrase. That in 2008, while he was working on Women Are Heroes, he began this project. I mean, I noticed that in some of the images of poor women around the world, he was drawn to images of older women, not exclusively. And he made this shift and decided, okay, let's start this other project about older people around the world. And he engaged the community to work on this, to identify individuals, to use their labor, in effect, to paste these larger-than-life portraits in their neighborhoods. And he tried to display what he referred to as the oldest inhabitants of the place. It begins in Cartagena, Spain. And for him, this is important because this is the last city defending against Franco in the Spanish Civil War. And so that it allows a connection between this long-term memory and a certain kind of understanding of Spanish history in the 20th century. He goes then from Cartagena to Shanghai and Havana and Berlin and Istanbul and Los Angeles to explore the lives of inhabitants who had, like his grandmothers, lived across a very, very, a period of very, very dramatic change, whether cultural, social, economic, political, etc. And as the catalog puts it, the resulting series not only reflects on change in memory, modernization and globalization, but also changes cultural perceptions of the elderly, celebrating their aging appearance as beautiful at a monumental scale. So we can view the images as stills on the wall, but they're visible to a larger public, either as illustrations in books or as moving images in videos posted to the internet. This isn't the old people, obviously, but this is the project Portrait of a Generation, where in Paris, he's showing a resident of the suburbs and sort of forcing the Parisian public to understand who they're sharing the Paris region with. You can easily find this. The URL is there, but if all you do is Google JR Wrinkles of the City, that will take you right here. And there are these projects. The videos are available. You can order the books if you like, in those cases where they produced books. But we have Istanbul, Berlin, Havana. You click on it, you get JR himself. You get these collaborations. He had worked with a Cuban-American artist, Jose Parla, who did all these squiggles that went along with the portraits, and a few other examples here. So let me hold it there for a second and say the projects provide a long-term background with accompanying essays that cover very long periods of time. I already mentioned the Cartagena project with this memory of the Spanish Civil War. The oldest subjects could have remembered the events themselves, and they certainly would have grown up with stories of that resistance. Similarly, the Istanbul project anchored itself in memories of the founding of the Turkish Republic in the 1920s and in nostalgic thoughts about different ethnic and religious communities. And here, there may have been a nostalgia that JR had and a nostalgia that his subjects had. Yet few would remember the early days of that republic, and the elders themselves speak of their everyday lives in their families, or as artists, or as keepers of birds, just to pick some examples. The Berlin project certainly builds on recent memories of the end of the Cold War, but JR's introduction insists on the longer-term history of the city with special mention of the Nazi period.
David, if we could close up now shortly.
Yep. Even the Los Angeles project, focusing on the careers of people in the film industry, tries to root itself in a longer-term background of American natural and cultural history. Perhaps the Havana project best links the elders' own memories to a historical, in this case revolutionary, background that past weighs heavily on the lives represented in a project and book produced, as I say, in collaboration with Jose Parla. Accounts by individual subjects often evoke the revolution. Their portraits take on the importance of revolutionary images of Fidel or Che, but they also recount family histories, working lives, music, and food. The reach of the revolution and the impacts of Soviet support and collapse, as well as the American embargo, are not far from the surface. As a way of offering an even longer historical context, the book includes a chronology that actually begins in 1492. The chronology for the Shanghai volume begins in the 1840s, and that for the Los Angeles volume begins in 1602. How should we contextualize the project? We should consider the ways in which old people have been represented in the arts. Often they've been stand-ins for moral qualities, sometimes representing the decrepit body as distinct from the more youthful soul, sometimes being tied to a desire to hold on to life, a representation of greed and vanity, and sometimes embodying wisdom. In this project, we're invited to recognize the wisdom of old age and the beauty of the wrinkled face in the midst of large-scale social and economic forces that threaten their world. and as happened in some of JR's banlieue images, the faces were pasted on walls that were soon to be demolished. For a time at least, the aged loom over the everyday, an aged eye overseeing the soccer game I showed a moment ago, or a wrinkled face representing a decrepit neighborhood that itself is being encroached upon by construction. Thus, the public sees them, but they also have the sense of being watched over by the aged residents of the neighborhood. I just want to make a couple of comments. JR is incredibly entrepreneurial, and one of the things he produced in association with this project was a book for young readers, in which he used some of the same photos and shorter versions of the autobiographical accounts that appear in the books, the larger books. So in a way, what you've got is an attempt to bridge generational difference. Now, there's a danger, of course, in thinking in terms of a uniform way of aging. And we might be tempted to think that while there are these individual differences, somehow they all look alike. And it gets me back to what Julia was talking about stereotypical images of the aged, and you sort of plop them down in one city or another. But I think there is this tension in JR's project. You can go from one city to another, focus on wrinkles, overlook differences, or we can view them as speaking from a very different and precise historical, geographic, and personal contexts. We have to recognize also that his elders are overwhelmingly working class. Each story of the 20th century is different. Each neighborhood seems to be experiencing its own form of social life, neglect, or gentrification, but all permit an appreciation of non-elite bodily aging, often an active and assertive old age, sometimes a nostalgic or resigned one, and all place great emphasis on the role of memory, its simultaneously private and public nature. Final word. Writing this piece in time of COVID-19, I'm very aware of the indoors and the outdoors, and I'm struck by the importance of the outdoors for JR's aged subjects. We do glimpse some interiors, but the emphasis on the aged out of doors, their portraits pasted on exterior walls. The epidemic struck during the Brooklyn exhibition, so I never made the third visit I had planned. Nonetheless, we can read the books and consume the videos at home, knowing that the pasted images themselves will not last as the walls behind them, and even entire neighborhoods disappear. And we may think of the subjects themselves, with their long historical memories, reaching their own ends. Thank you.
David, thanks very much. And we see synergy between these three talks with an emphasis on the visual, what we appreciate, and both private, public memory, and indeed the tension for gerontologists. We know that the big feature of aging is inter-individual variability, and yet older people are so often shoehorned into one size fits all. So delighted that Susan Pickard will be able to discuss these three fantastic talks. Susan from the University of Liverpool, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Des. And it's really interesting that you've just summarised all three papers very differently to the way I'm about to do it. So what I thought I'd do, I've only got a few minutes. I really enjoyed all these papers, as you say, Des, in a variety of ways and through different disciplinary orientations. I guess they all address how representations of old age contribute to more social and political understandings of old age. And so what I want to try and do is highlight a few links and continuities between the papers. And to do that, I'll pick out just one or 2 points from each. And apologies to the authors of the papers for probably seeing the papers very differently to the way that you've done as authors. So first, I'm going to try and link Julia's paper with Gemma's, and to say that both very insightful papers examined the binaries through which old age is created socially and ideologically, among many other things. So to start with Julia's paper, this is done through the contrast that she makes between Neo-Impressionism, with its praise of linearity, angular clarity and structure, representing youth and vigor, and Impressionism's soft, smudged diffuseness, which represents old age and the slackness or decline linked to the physical structure of the aging eye. As she makes clear in her longer papers, I should say, of course, I've had the great good luck to read the longer papers associated with these presentations. She also makes a binary relationship between a positive masculinity associated with Neo-Impressionism and a negative femininity in this contrast. Gemma's paper similarly makes use of both a negative and positive representation of aging in the context of the COVID debates. Now, in the longer paper that Gemma sent me, I picked out, and I'll still use it because I think it's very interesting, the example of Captain Tom, a super ager or corona hero, as she calls him, who by his exceptional nature makes possible the perception of most older people as aging in the opposite way, i.e. with vulnerability and risk. And this, as I was reading, it reminded me of the kind of super ager example or the case study you often find in health and social policy discourses, who in one way or another represents successful old age, as well as conjuring its opposite into being, if you like. So both papers demonstrate for me that such binaries sustain each other. Indeed, they make no sense without each other. And more importantly, they do nothing to challenge the dominant representations of aging in terms of decline, risk, weakness, and ill health, and unproductivity. While our habit of thinking in binary pairs is well ingrained, going back to Aristotle, still both papers provide powerful examples of how such binaries work to shape arguments and understandings of old age in both historical and contemporary contexts, and very richly so. Thirdly, there is continuity between Gemma's suggestion that gerontologists work with the media to provide sort of critical input or friendly critical input on the question of how we represent old age and to resist stereotypes of this kind, and the conclusions of David's paper. So in David's fascinating discussion of JR's Wrinkles of the City project, among many other things, David looks at the way JR's posters do important cultural work in implicitly asserting the beauty and value of working class bodily aging, including wrinkles, and also through the prominent location of these kind of posted artworks, or indeed posters, they literally bring these images into the everyday realm. So this is work that has the opposite effect to that of the Neo-Impressionism, as discussed by Julia, as well as of the media representations discussed by Gemma, in very much challenging the depiction of old age as the other. Finally, JR's work also suggests other ways of judging old age aesthetically, which I found very interesting. And I'm reminded of David Lowenthal's suggestion that if old is beautiful, rare, and even romantic when it comes to buildings, then why not to people? Returning full circle to the point that Julia made about Chevreul's idea of the weakness of the eye in age, and how this is where physical aging began, in this weakening structure of the eye, and then this was in turn represented in vagueness, colours, and edges sliding into each other, which the Neo-Impressionists view as negative. I am also personally reminded of the exact opposite, actually. Not of its shortcomings, in other words, but what I'd like to call the merciful generosity of the aging eye, unlike the rather cruel 2020 vision of the young, and especially, I might add, of my students. And I'll finish there.
Thanks very much. That was a phenomenal summing up, and it's just wonderful to get the linkages. And indeed, I was very taken at the back of the beautiful buildings, the Ruinenwert, that was a big thing, certainly in romantic, German romantic art, and Gerhard Richter. So we will have 10, just for those, with slight change in timing. So we'll give ourselves 10 to 15 minutes panel discussion, and then we'll have a rest break. So I'd like to invite any of the panel to comment on what thoughts arise out of them, if you can unmute.
Thanks very much to all the presenters, and Susan, to you for your fantastic summary. It's really a challenging task to do this in such a brief period of time. My comment actually goes to Julia. I think I have two takeaways from your paper. The first one is kind of you query and actually challenge what you called photographic literalism. And of course, that is a dominant paradigm that we're deeply embedded in terms of, if you think of the theory of photography, Roland Barthes, you know, the has-beenness, he's written about this photograph of his mother in particular, yeah, and the relationship we entertain to photographs as documents which also engender feeling. So maybe you can talk about that. But my second point was about the relationship of the Neo-Impressionists to the Impressionists, because of course, you could say, all new art movements from 1800 onwards challenge previous art movements by claiming the new, the novel, the innovation. So expressionism after Neo-Impressionism comes along, and they topple both Neo-Impressionists and the Impressionists. So from the French Revolution onwards, youth dominates any notion of paradigm change. So I wonder how you can conjoin these two lines of analysis, the kind of the critique of the dominance of the literalism of photography on the one hand, and then this immanent mechanism of claiming the new in regard to art history or literary history or any kind of cultural history.
Those are such great questions. And if I could, I would take up all of the Q&A time answering them. But to try to be economic about it, I think that the problem with the problem that I'm describing is one not of photography, but of the photograph in the media and of the origins of how photographic media function. And absolutely the Bart's whole description of the incredible power that images have over us emotionally, anti-rationally, etc. Gemma also wrote in the comments, she mentioned one of these competitions in which that produced rich and varied images of older people. I'm very skeptical about the idea of producing positive pictures of aging, because what I'm describing is really a kind of photojournalistic gaze whose very problems are semiotic and economic, and these will compromise it over and over again. They're very powerful forces. So I think it's very difficult actually even if you're finding a photographic image that's very rich and emotional, it's still selling something in a sense, and it's often still illustrating pre-existing definitions or ideas. So as for avant-gardism, absolutely, that it's all about being the new avant-gardism's association with youth. Actually, I think explicitly comes about in the second half of the 19th century, in the way that I'm describing, and with age as we understand it. The idea that the defenders of Neo-Impressionism literally described and purged literally described getting rid of older generations of older artists. So there's an explicitness there that is different from just a kind of continuous immanence of like avant-garde struggle. And I think it's really, we have to think of it, of the avant-gardism of the second half of the 19th century as inscribed in a modern economic model of old age, of non-productive, etc. So those are my, not as short as they should have been, answers, but those are really good questions. Thank you.
Gemma, if I can just ask you, obviously, you're looking at very much at perceptions. Do you see secular trends or changes? Do you see any, you see hashtag no more wrinkly hands. Do you see that there is the possibility for change, for enriching the visual palette, or are we caught in a warp here?
To be honest, I think we are caught in a bit of a warp. I found this a really hard, depressing project, and I already felt guilty for not being like a proper gerontologist who was actually out there doing something useful. So I thought this was going to be useful, but in fact, I kind of tortured myself and my research team. But Brona Byrne, who I worked with, is an expert on disability, and we need to ally more often, because actually, particularly the disability rights movement, and they have a great way of articulating, the social model of disability and all these different approaches. And I think they're ahead of us. So I think the more we reach out across disciplines, just what you're leading now, Des, but the more we do that, the more we can really start to be self-critical of our own work as well. And me with social policy, I'm always trying to do something. It's okay for me to just critique it. I want to actually do something. So one of the things we've done is we've teamed up with Age Platform, and they're helping us develop a strategy. But I am finding I am taking far too long to get this paper to the point where I feel like I'm saying something fair about the media, but we're also getting past out of the jungle that we're in ourselves. It's extremely hard to study something so contemporary that's actually unfolding. But I think with the rights perspective now that Brona is bringing in, we're starting to see the wood for the trees. So hopefully then I can start to work with Age platforms to try and get that message to journalists, because they're struggling with this thing unfolding as well, you know.
Yes, and sometimes reaching for the quick and easy. Wendy, you had some, thanks very much, Gemma.
Yeah, no, thanks for really interesting presentations. I say that and I agree with these stereotypes of images of aging, you know, the positive, negative, and either positive and negative, it's very hard to get out of that. But I said to add another sort of thing, I'm going back to like Tom's work, we started looking at some of these images, and of course we forget that the digital is where most people see, a lot of people see these now. And of course we all have algorithms. So if we all put in the top 10 images of older people and the same keywords, we would all come up with different things depending on our previous histories, and you know what I mean. So, and that goes through our Twitter, for our Facebook, through everything else. So there's also this added complex of you know the proliferation of these images, which are in the digital that as well, you know. And you know, I don't know if you, Gemma, you had anything, whether you know you saw any of that, and or you know, so it goes to what Julia was saying as well.
Right. Actually, can I respond to that really quickly? Just to say that I think that's why I believe in JR's project as a critique. Right. My skepticism finally evaporated, because the key to, I think, what I'm describing is a kind of dematerialization of the image as it enters the realm of the reproducible and eventually the digital and the internet. That's why the internet is the most pernicious place for these kinds of images. And what I think is the key for me with JR is the layering onto the urban fabric. And that's such an that's actually such a visible critique of the economic realities that I'm on board with. But yeah, the physical mapping onto the physical space is a critique of that kind of dematerialized image.
Thanks, but a really interesting thought, Wendy, to what extent the AI of Google is shaping that which we think we're seeing. And I can see a project immediately there. A question from David. Could you say more about the relationship of these monumental images to their locations?
A little bit. I mean, I think the projects were intended to involve local people. But in the end, I mean, JR interviewed potential subjects who were supposedly encountered, you know, randomly, but then interviewed them and selected ones that he thought would work, and tried to get whatever local knowledge he could to make it appropriate. They should be here rather than there. But it was also with the understanding that they wouldn't last, except in the books, you know, on the internet, and so on. So I think when I look at them, I don't always see the kind of historical background that he claims is there, but he wants it to be there. And sometimes it's I mean, it's nice to think about the connection to the Spanish Civil War and the Republic that may not have been foremost in people's minds. But anyway, yeah, I think there was some attempt to do that, but it's a balancing act between universalizing and particularizing. But if I may, I had a question for Julia.
Yep.
So I really enjoyed this sort of intersection between science and arts and the focus on the emerging mass media. I'm wondering about the legacy of Chevreul, but also the sort of origins of what he was doing. So for the legacy, when I think about, and you may at this point know more about this than I do, about French medicine in the early 20th century, I think they were looking more back at Charcot than at Chevreul, but maybe it was an even balance. And it would be interesting to know about that. Does this become the sort of medical, the visual element of the medical model? The other thing is about the origins of the images. Of course, Charcot also used photography, although we tend to think more about the hysteria work than the old age work. But there are earlier images. It might be worthwhile looking at some of those from the tradition of, you know, was mentioned much earlier, the 100-year-old people. I think of Jean Jacob, the 120-year-old man during the French Revolution. So, you know, something that was a popular image when Chevreul himself was young. So that may not be what you want to do, but it's something that I think would be really interesting.
Yeah, and I'll just those are all really, really good, leads to follow. I'll just mention really quickly. There's a book called Medical Masculinities by a woman named Mary Hunter. That for those of you who are interested in this intersection of like gender and the scientific gaze and so on, it's a really, really good book. But she talks about Charcot, who was very keen to represent himself and to be represented as, like, would never have allowed for such a photo shoot as Nadar did for Chevreul, right? He was always holding or near or visually analyzing disrobed hysterical women, as you know. And also Charcot, the body of women that he looked at, they were old women in old age. I think that's not been adequately talked about, but and he's always incredibly self-possessed, even elegant. So it's a very different image of scientific of scientific capacity in Charcot.
So listen, thanks very much. A very rich panel discussion. I really feel very energized, but I feel like Procruste is cutting off the legs of his guests by shortening everybody. But I really appreciate the effort all the speakers took to bring their talks in on time. It's been fantastic. It's now 16:25 Irish time at 7. So we'll re-meet at 16:35 at a comfort break, where Rena Knuff of the University of Groningen will be our chair. Thanks very much.
Welcome back, all of you. I hope you had a nice break and you're all refreshed to go for the second part of this session. We have 2 papers coming up. I'm sure they will be nice and exciting papers, but I won't take too much of their time. We start off moving to Austria, to Ulla Krieberneck from the University of Graz. She is an assistant professor at the Institute of American Studies. And I'll give you the floor.
I'll start. I have my timer here as well. As this is the section on methodologies, I decided to talk about literary gerontology or aging studies, and I'll be happy to discuss the differentiation between the two of them. But it's much easier with a concrete example. So I decided to adapt my title a little bit, including Atwood's short story Torching the Dusties as a showcase example. So today I'd like to talk about the role of literary gerontology and its preoccupation with the aesthetic power of stories, recognizing the value of literary criticism and aging studies to the understanding of what it means to age. As literary critics, we can contribute to a broader societal discourse on age and aging by sharing our understanding and interpretation of the aesthetics, the metaphors, and the symbols of fictional narratives. So I'll use Atwood's short story, Torching the Dusties, which came out in 2014 as an example, but let me first start to talk about a few remarks about literary gerontology. With the narrative turn, film and fiction have been functionalized by gerontologists to achieve a better understanding of what it means to grow old. Literary texts, have been included in textbooks such as this one for students of sociology, nursing, or medicine to bring, to quote Tom Cole and others here, the authors or editors, to bring the humanities to students in order to evoke the humanity of students. It helps, the editors write, to form individuals who take charge of their own minds, who are free from narrow and unreflective forms of thought, and to act compassionately in their public and professional words, unquote. This is crucial, of course, especially for medical or nursing students. Yet many gerontologists, unlike Tom Cole, have been hesitant to acknowledge the relevance of literary critics' study of film and fiction as a method in interdisciplinary gerontological collaboration. There is, of course, also a subversive element in this kind of study, such as reading a text against the grain in the feminist tradition, for instance, that literary gerontologists can offer. And there's, exactly about, this debate that we are having in the GSA about the question of the arts and humanities. So as a literary studies scholar working in the field of aging studies, I approached this topic with a nod to Anne Wyatt Brown, who argued that it was a daunting task for scholars to, quote, study gerontological issues and theories master an unfamiliar social science vocabulary, and attract an interdisciplinary audience capable of responding intelligently and critically to their insights, unquote. And Anne Wyatt Brown admires, she says, those pioneers among literature scholars who have since the 1980s, quote, mastered gerontological theory, thereby bridging the gap between the two fields and creating a legitimate subspecialty in literary studies, unquote. I fully agree with Anne Wyatt Brown here, but I also support Roberta Meyerhofer's point of view when she adds that the field of literary gerontology can only be established with a better understanding of what literature is and how it works, rather than with literary critics having to use traditional gerontological methods, unquote. So in the last decade, even though aging studies still gets hegemonized by gerontology very often, we have started to gain a new self-understanding and consciousness as literary studies scholars, using our own approaches and methodologies very often together with gerontological theories. And of course, this is now something that we have been developing with theories such as Paul Higgs and Stephen Katz's and so on. So as a showcase example, I'd like to discuss Margaret Atwood's short story, Torching the Dusties from 2014, from her collection, The Stone Mattress, which is a dystopian text, to show how a literary gerontological reading can facilitate a better understanding of the development of current discourses about old age. So you see here the book cover and Atwood, and on the right-hand side, you see the DVD cover, I guess, or the film poster. This has been made into a movie by Marlene Goldman from the University of Toronto, who many of you know. And she uses the slogan here, burn, baby, burn. It's our turn. So Torching the Dusties follows Wilma and Tobias, two 80-year-old companions in their who are trapped inside Ambrosia Manor that you see here on the screen, an upscale gated retirement community. And the residence is besieged by a violent mob, an anti-elderly movement called Our Turn. The group, operating internationally in large numbers, they say millions are rising up, gathers around nursing homes wearing baby masks. You can see that here at the door. They set out to literally torch the Dusties, and they set care homes on fire all across America, North America, and seek to clear away the parasitic dead wood at the top and the dust balls under the bed. Ambrosia Manor's inhabitants no longer believe the radio announcement that help is on its way. Public discourse has shifted towards a normalization of the old as other, the fourth age as a black hole, as social death, as Haim Hassan maintains, or in the words of Chris Gillett and Paul Higgs, old age is clearly represented as an undesirable social imaginary here. And this is reflected and perpetuated in the media in the story, as is shown when Wilma, the story's focalizer, listens to a panel discussion on a radio show in which the binary opposition of old and young becomes evident. And I'm quoting for the story. They quibble to and fro about whether this thing that's going on is an outbreak of thuggery and assault on the whole notion of elders and civility or families, or is it, on the other hand, understandable, considering the challenges and provocations, and to speak quite frankly, the shambles, both economic and environmental, that those under, say, 25 have been saddled with? There is rage out there, and yes, it's sad that some of the most vulnerable in society are being scapegoated. That's the radio interview. So the talk show pits young against old, insinuating that geronticide might actually be a good solution, as the elderly are, quote, eating up the healthcare dollars, most of which are spent on those in the last stages of, the host announces that they will now take calls from their listeners, unquote. As in Atwood's other work, her use of sarcasm as a means of social critique is evident. Her tale problematizes the way in which old age and the old body is othered, stigmatized as useless, inefficient, and burdensome in a society that's based on production and consumption. And the solution portrayed in the story is radical. Old age is being constructed in Atwood's tale as a target group against whom injustice is gradually becoming discursively legitimated. In the story, one of the strategies of this legitimization is linking old age to climate change. The young mob kills old people because, as they argue, they have messed up the planet with their greed and selfishness, which has always been, as Stephen Katz points out, quote, a popular theme in early geriatrics and gerontology and remains to this day a common public misperception, unquote. In an interview, Atwood actually explains her choice of topic. It's a logical outcome, she says, of where our demographic is going. No life form can exist beyond its exhaustion of its food supply. No life form can exist beyond its exhaustion of its oxygen supply, and no life form can exist beyond its exhaustion of its fresh water supply. And all of those things are finite. At that point, she says, things usually get unpleasant. In Torching the Dusties, things are actually really getting unpleasant due to this discourse of exhaustion. The rationale behind the young group's aggression against the old is also motivated by their rage against the carelessness with which previous generations used to treat nature and natural resources. You're probably familiar with these pictures here. That's sort of a parallel discourse. The old are positioned as scapegoats who are responsible for the world's disastrous state. And our turn expresses this unmistakably. Quote, they say it's their turn, says Tobias. Their turn at what? At life, they say. They say we've had our turn, those our age. They say we messed it up, killing the planet with our own greed and so forth. And then Wilma says, yeah, we actually did, but not on purpose. So to highlight their innocence, the young activists wear baby masks. And you see here again a still from Marlene Goldman's film. And a quote from the story, chubby, smiling babies. Some say time to go. Time to go, says Wilma? Babies? What does that mean? The mob says it very clearly. Time's up. Torch the dusties. Hurry up, please. It's time. Atwood's dystopia deals with what Sarah Falkus calls a generational anachronism or disorder. And she writes, quote, especially with climate change and the looming ecological devastation, it's no surprise that writers turned to a genre that highlights our vulnerability like almost no other genre. Very often, longevity and the kind of generational anachronism or disorder is at the core of such texts that can be read through the lens of aging studies and or eco-criticism, ideally both. And I think it's very productive to read aging studies together with eco-critical interpretations, and we are currently trying that in a new project we're developing in Graz. Such dystopias as Atwood's story here are very typical at the moment, and lots of them have been popping up. And P.D. James's The Children of Men is a classic from 1992, but also Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, or Lucy Kirkwood's play, a post-apocalyptic eco-risk drama, The Children. And all these texts actually deal with societies in which, a quote from Sarah Falkus, the life course, progress, and the promise of the future are all disrupted by threats to generational continuity. So dystopia can actually teach us quite a bit about that. And these threats, a kind of clash of generation, is not a new topic in literature. Already, Anthony Trollope's The Fixed Period from 1882, and which is based on Shakespeare's contemporary Thomas Middleton's The Old Law from 1618-19, discusses geronticide to get rid of the burdensome old. Just like Torching the Dusties, these are dystopian satirical texts. But while Atwood's text ends with the nursing home going up in flames and normalizes the burden narrative of old age, as Andrea Cerise or Heike and also Stephen Katz have called it, the Old Law spares the old. It features two antagonists whose debate is important until today. So in the Old Law, there are two men discussing these two opposing positions, basically. In an article on the Old Law, Schottland writes that it anticipates the ethical philosophy that we today describe as the ethics of care, while the utilitarian approach relies on a calculation of what policy will achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. Care ethics valorizes caring for those in need and prioritizes personal interconnectedness. And I think that's also shown in Atwood's texts very clearly. So in my opinion, Torching the Dusties includes a hint to the Old Law, because Wilma actually has a visual impairment, and that's Charles Bonnet syndrome, and she sees tiny figures dressed in fine costumes that appear as benevolent hallucinations. So at the end of the story, Wilma and Tobias watch the bright flames consuming the nursing home, and they wonder why there are no fire trucks, and hearing their fellow residents fading screams, they hope that they'll have a quick death. So once more, Wilma is actually accompanied by those little people that are very grotesque, and they just appear in her head, and they say, and she says, they're blended with them, flickering and soaring are the little people, their red garments glowing from within, scarlet, orange, yellow, gold. They are swirling upward. They are so joyful. They meet and embrace. They part. It's an airy dance. Look, look, they are singing. This really reminds me of a Renaissance dance. And Middleton is actually a Renaissance author. So it could be seen as an intertextual reference. And I think there is quite a bit of proof there in the story. She also describes these costumes. So all this can actually be seen. And I'm concluding here, really, this is my last paragraph, that this kind of intertextuality is something that literary gerontologists can look at. And interestingly, however, this story has very often been read in an ageist way, I think, because what we really have to take into account here is that Wilma, as a frail and old and visually impaired woman, she has agency in the story. She's the focalizer. And so having agency in old age shouldn't be undermined by interpretations that are guided by preconceived and stereotypical notions of age and aging as decline, as Roberta Meyerhofer has also pointed out. Conventional interpretations of dystopian texts is disempowering because the victimized frail old people are often ageist readings. As literary gerontologists, I think we can reveal aspects such as intertextuality and symbols and contribute to bringing these hidden meanings to light. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ulla, for this very nice and excellent paper. I think it very well shows the power of literary studies in making us question aging. And the power of the arts is also very much a topic of Rob Zwijnenberg's research. It has been for a long time. He is Emeritus Professor of Art and Science Interactions at Leiden University. So he will be talking about how art can make us feel uncomfortable. So Rob, the floor is yours.
So these artworks by South African Dutch artist Marlene Dumas, and these are sculptures by Belgian artist Belinde de Bruckheer. Why am I showing these artworks? A short project description of the Framing Aging research project includes the following sentence. It de-essentializes the notion of biological matter, of the body and bodily change, of mind and matter, and of the natural chronology from birth to death. Of course, I agree wholeheartedly with this, but how do we avoid that to de-essentialize? In fact, goes no further than introducing multiple perspectives. How do you make sure that to de-essentialize means that the fluidity, the indeterminacy of concepts such as body and physical change, matter and mind, is consequential to scholarly thinking about these concepts? It is my contention that we cannot do without art if we want to achieve this theoretical consequentiality of to de-essentialize. But first, let me explain why it is so important to de-essentialize so seriously. Biomedical research on healthy aging is consequential for society in a number of ways. To a much greater extent than the humanities, the medical sciences determine tone and content of the social and academic debate about aging. And the tone of the medical view of aging is, in a way, antagonistic. Some of us, at least I am, are old enough to remember this call. The longevity issue of the MIT Technology Review replaced war with old age. Old age is over if you want it, which is what is implicitly implied here in this replacing of words is that old age is the enemy we are at war with, and that we can beat this enemy only with the help of the medical sciences. The whole issue contains all kinds of articles that confirm this view. In this issue, there are no fundamental reconsiderations reconsideration of who and what we are as humans in the face of all these medical innovations regarding aging. The underlying medical notions about the human body and who and what we are as humans are not challenged. And the question remains how to prevent that a humanities perspective on aging is not unnoticeably fed by biomedical ideas about who and what we are as human beings, about health and old age. Another reason of the power of the voice of the medical sciences in society is that medical research into aging has gone hand in hand with commercialization, the commodification of old age. For example, this company with commercialization of novel therapeutics targeting human aging, and this company with as mission this statement. Words like targeting and this chilling phrase, the aging process and diseases of aging have robbed humanity of the elements of life that make it worth living, reveal specific conceptions of what it means to be human and of human physical and mental growth and decay. And again, old age is presented here as the enemy we must fight. In addition, there's the ever closer financial entanglement between biotech industry, research, and academic research. And I can recommend this book if you want to know more about this, this entanglement. And this entanglement raises all kinds of questions of whether academic independence in ethical considerations can still exist. For instance, here's an example of such financial relation between GlaxoSmithKline and the University of Berkeley. And here is a response to that. Where's the line between industry and academia? We should not underestimate the combined power and impact of biotech industry and academic medical voices on the issue of aging, and we should not overestimate our humanities impact. However, this bleak conclusion is an inspiring reason for me to take the De-Essentialize project very seriously. As humanities scholars, we must ensure that in academic and public discussions about aging, we apply our own point of views about what it means to be human that enable us to analyze and criticize the medical approach of aging at a fundamental level. The medical approach to aging ignores the fake wishes and desires of individuals in everyday life, the complexities and ambiguities that define or rule our individual life, the opacity of our own needs and desires, the uncertainty and risk of life that we experience every day, which give our lives weight and substance. At the end of 2019, I stumbled upon the book In Praise of Risk by Anne Dufour-Martel, a French philosopher and psychoanalyst. A few months later, the book had an almost creepy topicality. In these times of COVID, everyday life is now dominated by risk on a scale that most of us, at least in the Western world, have never experienced or even imagined. We only have to open up the newspaper to read how difficult most people find it to deal with uncertainty, with the simple observation that life is risky, ambiguous, and complex, and that this has always been and always will be the case. It turns out to be very difficult for most of us to accept that we can't expect certainty in our lives. However, it is paradoxical in a sense that the elimination of all risk is an important value for medical sciences and not entirely unjustified, of course. This does, however, mean that within biomedical sciences, ethical considerations about a medical innovation as such are no longer considered separately from patient safety and risk assessment issues. If patient safety and benefits are guaranteed, then a new biomedical application is almost by definition ethically sound. The medical sciences thus contribute to the idea that creating a risk-free society is possible and the most desirable goal. Dufour-Martel describes how we have become accustomed to transferring risk to the logic of the market, the commercialization of risks by making us dependent on medical and luxury products that promise us healthy aging and a happy and risk-free life. However, Dufour-Martel shows in her book that risk is the inalienable core of our personal lives, and that trying to avoid but also denying risk leads to erasing your own existence. She writes, I quote, "The very utterance of zero risk is an absurdity because it actually would annul the very reality of which it attempts to speak. Peril must be faced head on. This is the least among the forms of courage that might save us. We can recover from pain, catastrophe, or mourning, but evil will always claim a share. We will never be saved in advance." For her, Dufour-Martel, the risk of life is not the risk of dying, but risk is intensity, the leap into the void. The risk of life is the risk of opening something that is hidden, of unexpected insights or perspectives. The risk of life is the possibility of a transformative event. The risk of life, in the sense that Dufour-Martel gives to it, is an important starting point for me when I think about who and what we are as human beings and what we want to become and how we want to live vis-a-vis medical developments in the field of aging. To accept the risk of life is to accept that we will never be able to grasp the complexity and ambiguity of our own life. Only from an openness to the risk of life can we understand that the medical sciences are not good advisors on how to deal with the complexities and ambiguities of our life and our aging bodies. However, we need more than theory to be able to understand in depth what the risk of life means, what its value is for your personal life. And art can help us to develop such a deeper understanding. Art can give us a more embodied sense of the risk of life. What an artwork can do is to open up a space that is not characterized by a certain experience, but rather by a cloud of association that emerge in a disorderly way and call on us not necessarily to question the subject of the work of art, but to re-examine ourselves. In such a contemplation, the work of art can offer space for alternative ways of being in the world, a space with undefined possibilities, without predefined structures, without goals. A space where the things of the world, among them my body, have the freedom to appear without any imposed structure. It is an approach to a work of art that is not without risk. It is taking the risk of new experiences and knowledge, even if they are unwanted or disturbing. An artwork can open up a space that ruthlessly challenges my ideas about my own body and life, about what it is to be human, and as such requires an existential exploration of my own reflected and ethical notions on these matters. In any case, that was my experience when I looked at these paintings of Dumas and the artworks and the sculptures of the Bruckner. Unfortunately, and to conclude, Dorina, I don't have time to describe that experience in detail, but if you take the time to relate to these works, both bodily and intellectually, then one experience is ultimately inevitable. Your body faces another body that shows poignant traces of decay and disintegration. As a viewer, I intuitively perceive those traces as the traces of the risk of life. The work of art becomes active in my own body, in my own life. I'm touched, it has an impact on my body. The work of art becomes an appeal for me to relate to my own body and all matters concerning the body, individual identity and social multiplicity, atrophy and change, aging and frailty, and the ominous desire for permanence. These works do not give answers or consolation or resolutions. The only thing that they do is to open up the charged space that is a work of art, in which I, as beholder, am challenged to investigate the ethical reality of my own aging body and my own sense of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, for this very thought-provoking talk and images, of course. What strikes me very much about both papers is that it's sort of pointing at the arts also in terms of methodology, and that's the topic of the whole session today, that it really calls to us to move beyond only deconstructing aging or moving beyond critiquing methodologies or theories to a more activist position. So we can use the arts to really move towards another position or to get to other theories. So Dana Walrath, I would like to give the floor to you for a more extensive discussion of both papers.
Thank you for those wonderful papers, insightful papers, and the opportunity to spend time with the powerful work of Marlene Dumas, Berlinde de Broeker, and Margaret Atwood. You both emphasize the function of the arts, whether it's visual or verbal, to frame aging, to show its gray complexity, and also its integration to larger social, political, and economic forces. Now, Robert quotes nicely from the conference description, making this a matter of de-essentializing as the theoretical framework that can move us beyond the oversimplification of reducing this to just mere multiple perspectives. And here I'm reminded of de Broeker's speaking about placing her 3D installations in galleries so that when the viewer walks in, they first see a positive image from one direction, something like comfort or tenderness or connection. But then only as they walk around the piece, they'll see the negativity expressed in that same assemblage. Robert posits biomedicine as that opposing force that and asks us to really think about how we cannot be fed by biomedical ideas about who we are as human beings, about health and about old age. Now, Ulla shows the power of literary studies to answer that question of what it means to age and what it means to be human through her wonderful analysis of how Margaret Atwood answered this question in 2014 North America and Torching the Dusties. I'd love to hear what she's saying now in times of COVID. Ulla shows how Atwood brings agency to older individuals in the inner thoughts of Wilma, the focalizer of the story, and this is so often what's left out of our stereotypes. While she also situates this dystopian notion of burning down care homes all across North America within a series of larger structures. First, Wilma's families, from whom she's separated by the continent and by emotional history and so forth, of the ego and the stories that people tell themselves to paste over both their indignities and the abuses of power, which they may have benefited from through the character of Tobias, and then, of course, that wider critique of society that comes through both in the movement to burn down the care homes, and then the beautiful use of Charles Bonnet syndrome and the content of Wilma's hallucinations, which really do seem like they're referencing late-stage Euro-American imperialism. Both show how arts expand and tolerate the gray and situate aging within broader social contexts, instead of focusing on what biomedicine does, that preventing death, that is its job, the job that we've conferred to it as members of societies that practice this form of medicine. Underlying these framing questions, both papers ask us to link aging back to larger social justice questions, to questions of privilege and their intersection with health at individual, sort of preventing death, and societal in terms of framing risk, and then at corporate levels in terms of the monetization. They made me think of how can we move towards embracing death without it becoming gerontocide or without it becoming unjust. The artworks that Ulla and Robert reference ask us to query the pattern of aging in wealthy nations. We're looking at aging in Europe, North America, and places like Japan, where the dominant paradigms of production and consumption are embedded in biomedical practice and in care homes alike. How can we shift how we look at the end of life? Again, to harken back to De Broeker's words, she has said that her pieces reflect that line between torture and taking care. And this is certainly an aspect of biomedical end-of-life care. How can we balance individual and collective well-being in the care ethics that Ulla brings up when it comes to death? How can we zoom all of this out to a global level as the environmental movement asks of us? I loved how Ulla really engaged with this, showing that Atwood brings in the environmental movement, but then Ulla brings it forward to Greta Thunberg's appropriate anger and Margaret Atwood's own comments on the ideas behind the story. The interview that Ulla included about limited resources bear such a haunting resemblance to Timothy Snyder's thesis about the Black Earth, and how Hitler's rhetoric about the kind of scrambling for resources was opening up the door to killing. So I'm sure this isn't accidental. Margaret Atwood, as a public intellectual, has an entire work that's devoted to asking us to examine our social, political, and economic systems. And it was wonderful to see this done here in this paper. They both ask us to look at life expectancy and our end-of-life experiences from social justice perspectives, and to think about this in terms of the pandemic. To bear in mind things like statistics that have surfaced in my country of citizen, where race is the most salient social and political category, where, as of this writing, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx Americans all have death rates from the coronavirus that are 2.7 times higher than those of white Americans. How can we collectively make our discussions of aging and death global and connected to all people? Thank you.
Thank you, Dana, for this excellent comment on both papers that connect so very well. Can I ask both of you about the functioning of disgust in literature and the arts? Because it seems to function very much like a trigger for formulating an opinion or feeling uncomfortable about stereotypes and opinions on aging.
Excuse me, Rina, the function of what? Of discourse?
Disgust.
Disgust, okay, the function of disgust. I mean, if I just a brief off the top of my head, aging is very often seen, and I'm here using again a gerontological theory, as abject, and Paul is watching anyway. And so the abject old age is really visible, not so much in the movie adaptation, which actually lacks the Charles Bonnet syndrome, but yeah, I think all those nursing home representations that I've been working with in my habilitation, which is this kind of German-Austrian postdoctoral degree to become a professor, they all show that there's a lot of abject, disgusting characters. And it's interesting, the idea of the abject, that this brings me back full circle in a way to my Erasmus year that I did in 1994 with Anne Fuchs. And Anne back then actually alerted me to the term abjection as a very young student. And we read Franz Kafka's text. And I think that this kind of Christevian abjection can very, very well be applied to readings of frailty, of old age, of the fourth age. So there is a lot of disgust there. And this is a bit incoherent now, of course. Sorry, just off the top of my head.
There's two questions. Maybe Rob, do you want to reply very quickly first?
Well, just a quick answer. I understand your question, and I appreciate what Ulla says. To me, the artworks that I show are not about the aesthetics of disgust. It is much more about all these issues of frailty, permanence. So that would be my short answer.
Anne.
Okay, thanks very much to both of you for two very interesting papers. And coming at it from my own specialization, which is modernism, the 2 points struck me. Ulla, you talked about exhaustion, this discourse on exhaustion. And of course, the discourse of exhaustion really goes back to around 1900, when it proliferates across disciplines from sociology to psychotherapy, psychology, and so on. And of course, it is a reaction to the experience of modernization and acceleration. And Rob, you talked about, risk society. I was thinking of Ulrich Beck's theory of, modernity's attempt to eliminate risk through insurance policies, which also go back to, roughly speaking, modernity and the attempt to eradicate risk by calculating it all the time. So if we bring these two notions together, exhaustion on the one hand, and the attempt to regulate life, calculate risk, insure against risk, it seems to me that perhaps our contemporary understanding of aging is deeply embedded in modernity. So that's my thesis that I'm taking away from today's papers, that actually in order to understand our own understanding of aging, of the aging process as negative, we need to actually examine how it's bound up with the discourse around modernity from roughly the 1890s onwards. And that ties also in with what Julia was saying about the mediatization of photography and so on and so on. It's just an idea that I'm taking away. So thank you for your papers.
I totally agree with that. And I think that the book about from Unbu for Mattel is exactly about trying to reinstall a different approach to these issues than the modernity ideas that you just explained. So I completely agree with that. And that was, in a sense, also the gist of my paper, to try to unravel all the ideas behind our ideas of old age, and how we should introduce new ideas, much more coming from literature and art. So I agree.
Dana first, then Desmond, and then Julia.
Oh, all I was going to say was just that the disgust, I agree with what you said, Anne, that's absolutely where we are. But in terms of modernity and late stage capitalism being part, thank you, of how we are patterning death and how we need to really bring that lens to thinking about it differently. And I'm remembering at our end of our last session, we talked about, what will we do for our next topic? And this circles around death again, and how our fear of death, I think, does stem from the fact that we live in systems that put aging and death in terms of fear and our loss of economic productivity, whereas there are so many other valuable ways to look at death. Yes, of course, we're exhausted because we work like lunatics, and that's part of this system that hopefully we can undo together. So it was a comment more than a question. So I think Desmond Tobin had his hand raised.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you very much, Rena, for the opportunity to contribute, and thank you very much to all the speakers for what is an absolute roller coaster ride for me as a jobbing biomedical scientist. And just referring a little bit to Robert's comment, I do find the vocabulary of social science also very daunting. So the complexity is remarkable, and as a biomedical scientist, particularly a laboratory-based one, where there's a very much a reductionist view on human life in general, but definitely human medicine, it's quite difficult to pull back out at this really uber holistic view of aging, and just the natural curiosity of biomedical scientists, particularly when they're in the lab and they don't see the whole person, is to drive technological innovation as a kind of an end goal in itself, without really conceptualizing the impact. But on a personal level, I'm also kind of curious as to, particularly as I think Dana mentioned, this kind of European, North American, Japanese view of aging. To what extent has fragmentation of society created a situation where we're not really clear as to how much we can tolerate as an individual, as an isolated individual, without those support structures or referencing of our impending old age in terms of the challenges? So to what extent, this issue of risk, even the possibility of, older age transformative change through risk, are we prepared to accept, particularly when we are existing in a more atomized, environment where, the support structures from kith and kin are often not physically present, geographically present. So it's that kind of a balance for me as a biomedical scientist, driven by curiosity to figure out what is happening, and therefore what we can do to slow it from happening or to repair. And then on the other side is a personal thing about to what extent I will be prepared individually to accept the challenges within, a relatively unsupported environment. But thank you so much. It's a fantastic evening or afternoon worth of attention. Thank you.
I just wanted to say to Rob that it's to me, when you're entering a space like a gallery or something, I've when you put this discussion right up against this like very deep discussion of risk, all I can think about is the art market is like the most filthy, disgusting, money laundering sinkhole, and like vertiginous risks, and I mean, it's like the most disgusting market in the world. So I mean, it's funny that you like describe yourself in this very lyrical, romantic way, like you're having this like Stendhalian moment, and yet you're in like the midst of a modern marketplace that's just like makes the GlaxoSmithKline look like a nunnery. There you go.
Okay, thank you. I agree with Desmond. I think I have the same concerns and feelings, so I can, and I will come back to Julia. So I read all these books and all the theories about risk and all that kind of things, but then indeed I wonder myself, how do I live? And do I live up to what I just mentioned, just lectured you about? And I don't, of course, either. But that is part of my move to art, that I feel that when I indeed go to the gallery or read literature about it, that I hope that somehow I will be able to align my theoretical thoughts with my practical life. That is a split that I think everyone working in the field of humanities, but also in the field of the medical sciences, as you mentioned yourself, that you understand that there is this split or this divide between your own personal concerns and the machinery of biomedical sciences. I don't have yet an answer to that, but I feel that art can be one of these things in life that may help me to better adjust my life to my theories. And to come back to Julia, I of course totally agree. I took these two artists because my feeling was that most of you will know somehow these artists. I know of other artists that are not so much engaged in this commercialized art world, which I feel are perhaps better examples of than de Bruycker and Dumas. But it's a good point to think how you yourself, at the moment you try to find a way out of all these things and turn to art, at the same moment you fall into the trap of another commercialized, commodified world. And there are also books about that, Jarek, the force of art, which exactly explains that. But again, I don't think that I have a romantic perspective on art. Romantics, what I try to do is move away from the aesthetics, move away from the aestheticization of art, and also try to move away from the commodification of art, and try to relate on a very personal level to the artworks that I describe. I couldn't do it this afternoon. And well, yeah, of course, we live in this world and we can't escape from it. So I totally agree with you, and I will think about it a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Ulla and everybody else for wonderful comments and for a wonderful afternoon, really. I don't know how things will go on, so I'm more than happy to pass the floor to Anne, or Anne, shall I pass the word to you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to say other than to thank everybody for all your wonderful contributions, and also to the respondents who had taken on this very challenging task of responding to complex papers in a very limited period of time. And you've done it wonderfully. I suppose it has focused our discussion. We are learning as we are, running these webinars, so they change all the time. We adapt and change the format to make it work better. And we can all see that some strands emerge as very strong contenders for a conference. And of course, we will have our next webinar in February. We will consult with you about suitable dates. And maybe in the meantime, I could invite you all to think about perhaps 3 dominant strands from your perspective that you would like to take forward to a conference. We'll be discussing this next week, the organizers, but we would like to have your input. So if you could email us with suggestions for panels or conference topics, we would be really most grateful. I've enjoyed this afternoon very much. So I want to thank you all. Stay healthy, stay safe, and we're looking forward to seeing you sometime in February. So all the best to all of you. Bye-bye.